Hello and welcome everyone. Today I want to show you how to craft life-based gear for high-end minion builds using various meta techniques. Usually you want to start out with either a armor or an armor and evasion base for spell suppression. I usually want to use the base that has higher armor because that's the more pressing issue. Item level for helmets is 85. And we want to start out with a specific fracture, namely the plus level of all minion skill gems. The reason for that is that the vast majority of minion builds can profit from that. Scaling minion skill level scales damage, minion survivability, in some cases maximum number, for example for specters. And you can't really roll this by other means, because the total weight of the modifier is so low that it's pretty much impossible to ever roll this naturally, right? With a total weight of 36,000 prefixes, getting the +2 minion skill gems is just way too unlikely otherwise. The other thing we usually want from helmets is reservation efficiency on both the explicits and often the implicits as well, which means that we have to roll the item with essences of loathing. Now, for spell suppression based builds, the target modifier is spell suppression here, which is rather hard to roll. Takes you around 150 or so rolls, if I remember correctly. Yeah, probably around 150 or so rolls. The issue with this is that you can also roll an additional suffix, right? So reservation efficiency in addition to spell suppression and regen. Now, this was very lucky. Very often, this takes you a lot more rolls. In order to progress the craft, you will have to remove that additional suffix, and the only way to do that is with an annul, right? In order to streamline the process, I don't want to endlessly roll, so I'm going to use the undo function here. But every time I do that, every time you accidentally remove one of the target mods, so reservation efficiency and spell suppression, you would have to craft it again. Now, once you end up with an item that kind of looks like this, right? The two target suffixes and no other suffixes, and any amount of prefixes you want to make the exarch dominant. If it doesn't have influence, a lesser ember is enough for that. And then you want to use Eldritch Chaos Orbs to roll for a maximum life modifier. Now, once again, the item would be done now pretty much in terms of rolling. This is obviously not how it works on average. Very often you have to re-roll several times. As you can see here, this was a really lucky roll. This is something much more sensible, right? Rolling some 20 times or so with Eldritch Chaos Orbs. If you don't end up with a second prefix that you are comfortable with, let's say we didn't roll this prefix here, for example, right? Then you would have to use an Eldritch Exalted Orb to introduce an additional modifier. What we're looking for is usually armor and evasion, or if it's pure armor based, then just armor. Personally, I wouldn't overspend here. The additional armor you get from this modifier really isn't that important. Last but not least, you want to finish the item with a crafted modifier. A crafted suffix can either be elemental resistances or elemental and chaos resistances, or of course attributes, depending on what you need. Now, it's sensible to wait with the crafted modifier until you've finished the item. This does mean you have to introduce new prefixes via Exalted Orbs after rolling with Eldritch Chaos Orbs for the max life modifier, in order to not accidentally introduce a suffix that way. If you do start out with the crafted suffix first, then the likelihood of introducing a new modifier while rolling with the Eldritch Chaos Orbs is lower. So by all means, add the crafted modifier last. Now, with the implicits, I'm only going to do this one time because it's pretty much always the same. The way this works is you want to roll the modifier that you want as a tier 1 mod first. So in case of the helmet, this is reservation efficiency, and you should use the second highest currency to do that. because rolling this modifier, right, the reservation efficiency, with exceptional icons is just way too expensive, since it takes you around 70 rolls or so. Now, I don't want to waste anyone's time here, right? As I said, it should take you around 70 to 100 grand icons, right? I'm going to streamline this a bit. Let's say I rolled this modifier. The next step would be to introduce a tier 3 Ex.O mod for the other items. Where you start out with an Ex.O mod first, you would then obviously have to use an exceptional icon for a tier 3 Eta modifier. And what modifier you introduce here doesn't matter, right? Literally just use one. And then you want to use Orb of Conflicts to increase the tier of the target modifier, which in this case is reservation efficiency. Now, as long as you still have a tier 5 mod, I would use an Orb of Conflict again. If you ever go down to a tier 6 modifier, you would have to reroll the entire reservation efficiency mod. This might still happen. Speaking of, right, in this case, as I said, you would have to reroll the reservation efficiency, but as I mentioned before, I don't want to waste people's time. It takes around 70 to 100 tries or so. The good thing is now our Searing Exarch implicit is pretty high, right? So the Orb of Conflicts have a good chance of upgrading the reservation efficiency modifier. You can, however, still get unlucky, as you can see here, right? This is always a thing, right? This is why it's so important to roll with the grand icons and not the exceptional icons, because the likelihood of actually losing that modifier is relatively high. This is probably one of the most frustrating parts about crafting, right? You're also pretty much forced into getting this version of the modifier with the other modifiers on pretty much every other item. It's fine to introduce one of the conditional ones, so that only work while a pinnacle boss or a unique enemy is nearby. But for the reservation efficiency, we need this specific version of the mod, right? This is obnoxious, and right now I'm getting really unlucky. If you ever roll down the other modifier below tier 3, you would have to recraft a tier 3 version with an exceptional, well, in this case Ember, otherwise an Ichor, right? Now this time we got lucky, managed to get the reservation efficiency all the way up to tier 1. As you saw before, it is very RNG based. There's not much you can do outside of making sure that the tier of the secondary modifier is at least tier 3. After you've upgraded the target mod to tier 1, what you want to do is roll for the secondary implicit with, well, it's more economic to do it with grand embers. Personally, I don't really think it's worth using exceptional embers here because the difference is usually not too large. Interesting modifiers here are minion life, minion movement speed for melee minion builds, and of course curse effect, right? Can be despair if it's chaos, can be elemental weakness, whatever, right? And that would pretty much be it for the helmet. The next item I want to show you is the gloves. For the gloves, it kind of depends what you want to craft. If you want spell suppression, once again, you have to start out with a armor and evasion based and start out with the fractured spell suppression modifier. This is important because it's very hard to introduce these later on, especially since we're crafting the prefixes first. So getting that specific fractured modifier is imperative. In this case, we want to roll the item with Deafening Essences of Fear until we hit a tier 1 life mod. Should probably take you around 100 tries or so. If you're fine with a lower tier, that's also okay. Next step is, if you have an open prefix, is slamming Exalted Orbs. For that open prefix, obviously you can also introduce suffixes that way. So if you have open suffixes, it's usually sensible to first make the Exarch dominant, right? And then use an Eldritch Exalted Orb. In this case, we wouldn't have to do that, right? Because the suffix is already filled. And what we're looking for is, once again, Armor and Evasion, Pure Mod, the Hybrid Mod with Stun Block Recovery, or the other Hybrid Mod with Life. Now, for the suffixes, If this is good enough for you, you could obviously just keep them and then go ahead and craft the Eldritch Implicits. If that isn't good enough for you, if your suffixes are filled, you could annul one. In order to do that, you first have to make the Ether dominant. So if it already has a Exarch Implicit, you need to use a tier higher. And after that, you can use an Eldritch Annul. And then, well, there are some options here. What you can do is you can put on prefixes cannot be changed and reforge for specific resistance. Could be cold, fire, or lightning. Chaos is also an option if your build still needs that. Chaos is actually the easiest to do because there are fewer tiers. If at any point you introduce a second modifier, you would have to use an annul again, right? This can, within a reasonable amount of tries, give you a specific modifier if you're really looking for one. And after that, you would want to finish the item with a crafted modifier. Once again, can be elemental resistances or elemental and chaos resistance, can be attributes. Can also be this weird mod, minions recover 100% of their life when you focus. The way this works is you get an additional skill, the focus skill, which has a 4-second duration. At the beginning of that, your minions are healed fully. After the duration, the skill has a cooldown of 8 seconds. So essentially every 12 seconds, you get the ability to fully heal your minions. And especially in high-end content, let's say tier 17 maps, especially tier 17 back-to-basic strategies, this can be invaluable in order to give you a deterministic way to heal your minions. Now, this can still be disabled by something, right? Let's say you're playing a map with patches of Awakener's Desolation, or you're just fighting the Maven, right? There are a couple ways of disabling recovery, so keep that in mind that it might not work against these particular enemies or in these particular situations. Still, pretty interesting modifier that a lot of people don't seem to know about, so I just wanted to shed light on it. If your build can fit it, absolutely go ahead and use it. Otherwise, right, use one of the aforementioned crafted mods. Alternatively, you could also do something else, right? Like a veiled modifier. In order to do that, you would first have to wipe the suffixes, so prefixes can't be changed, and then use an orb of scouring, followed by another prefixes cannot be changed, and using a veiled orb. In Craft of Exile, this is still the Azhling Slam, so don't be confused here. Before unveiling, you want to put on a block mod for the gloves. Let's see, what's the most sensible one? Increased attack and cast speed while focused, right? Has the highest weight. This modifier has the same weight, but is actually an interesting modifier, right? So you would craft this and then unveil. And then you can pick and choose. In this case, we pretty much only choose this one, right? Now, very often you're also getting other modifiers that are relevant, which obviously don't show up right now. Yeah. Cold and chaos resistance in general, elemental and chaos resistances, right, are alternatives. And then there are, of course, things like attributes. In this case, we would have gotten nothing. So yeah, options are definitely there. You should, however, understand that this is very expensive, right? Especially later in the league. The veiled orbs tend to be pretty expensive, at least right now in this league. Hopefully they increase the drop chance in the future, but for now that's not really what we have, right? So this is one way of introducing a modifier, right? But it's a bit more limited in what you can introduce here, right? It's only really attributes, elemental and chaos resistance, or the minion recovery mod. Just like before, you finish the item with one of the modifiers that you didn't roll, right? So attributes, or this minion recovery mod. Now, if you want a specific veiled modifier on your item, and you don't need the spell suppression, then you could also start out with that veiled modifier from the get-go. Now, for attributes and elemental and chaos resistance, this isn't really worth it. But the build that I'm playing right now needs the plus level of socketed gem modifier. And trying to introduce that later on, while seemingly being cheap and convenient, is actually rather expensive, because you have to use the Veiled Orbs a couple of times, to the point where it's actually not economic to try to introduce that later on. What you should do instead is start out with a pair of gloves that have this modifier already, right, that you buy from the economy, that you get from Yoon yourself. No, obviously it's a prefix. The reason why this modifier is interesting is because it scales your auras. For the vast majority of auras, this isn't really worth it. But if you want to scale something like a purity, right? In my case, purity of fire, to get to the gem level 23, where your aura provides you with an additional % of maximum resistances, this is actually invaluable, right? So what I did was buy a bunch of Titan gauntlets with this modifier and a bunch of other mods. Optimally, you want to get one that has 4 mods, right? Something like this, right? The other 3 mods don't really matter. And then use a fracturing orb. Now, you might not be able to find items with 4 modifiers. If it has more modifiers, that's not that much of an issue, really, right? Let's say it has, I don't know, a full set of mods. Once again, the other modifiers don't really matter. What you can do is you can deterministically remove some of the unwanted modifiers. If it's a prefix, what you can do is you can make the Ether dominant and then use annuls to remove two of the modifiers that you don't want. This doesn't just work for these gauntlets, right? You can do the exact same technique in order to get access to a helmet with +2 level of minion skill gems, because there might not be enough of these fractured bases in the economy, or they simply might be too expensive, right? After you reduce the item to 4 modifiers, you want to use a fracturing orb. Whenever you fracture one of the undesirable mods, very often the item just ends up being garbage. If it's a tier 1 mod, you can try to sell it, but very often you would just have to toss the item and get back to this state, right? And then try again. Takes you pretty much 4 tries on average. Once you have the fractured modifier, you can roll the item just like before with Essences of Fear for the minion damage modifier. Rolling for the tier 1 life mod is now a bit more tedious. Takes you more tries on average. Obviously, you can streamline this process a bit by accepting lower tiers than tier 1. Personally, I wouldn't do this, but it is an option to cut down on costs. There's another thing that needs to be mentioned here, and that is the suffixes. You should look at the suffixes while you're rolling the item. If you ever get 2 decent suffixes that you really care about, let's say a lightning resistance and something else, while also having an open prefix, let's see if I can force that outcome. Oops. Yeah, like this, right? What you can do is you can, well, either craft a block mod or craft life right away. And then slam for last modifier. Now, are you going to get high tier modifiers on average? Not necessarily, right? This is random. It can be anything. It can be attributes, can be resistances. Very often will be shit mods. The thing is, you don't really lose much by doing this, right? Especially if you craft a lower tier modifier that doesn't really cost you anything, and then it's only an additional exalted orb for the chance of really, really streamlining the entire crafting process. Again, try to be a bit mindful when you're crafting. If you find 2 decent suffixes that your build can use, do this, right? It's not going to give you a perfect item, but in general, with this approach, that's much harder to do. On the flip side, this way of crafting an item, if you need this modifier or something similar, right, is much, much more economic. If you want to roll with the Essences of Fear and then introduce that via Veiled Orb Slam, on average, you're going to have to pay 100 divs just for that modifier. So keep that in mind. Now, if you don't get two decent prefixes ever, right, and you just eventually roll the maximum life modifier like this, then you have to craft the suffixes via Eldritch Chaos Orbs. Now, once again, if you're looking out for the spell suppression modifier, this isn't really the way to craft it, right? You pretty much have to start out with that modifier as a fractured mod because it's just too unlikely to roll higher tiers. If you don't care about that mod, right, once again, you can make the Eater dominant, in this case it already is, right, and then start rolling with Eldritch Chaos Orbs. What we're looking for is either 1 or 2 decent modifiers, and then slam on another and finish the item with a crafted mod. Can be attributes, can be resistances, or of course can also be the minion life recovery when focused. Which mod you choose and which mod you accept as a viable second modifier depends on, well, your build and your aspirations, of course. The higher the modifier, the more expensive this craft tends to get. But at least you don't have to pay 100 divines just to get that +2 level of socketed AoE gems. After crafting the explicits, you would just go ahead and craft the implicits, just like before. As I said, I don't want to do that again. For gloves, what you usually want is Mark Effect for the Eater implicit, which you want to upgrade all the way to tier 1, and then craft minion damage after that as either tier 3 or tier 4 modifier. If you are playing in a spell suppression based build, you might want to consider the spell suppression implicit. This is also an Eater implicit, so you can't have the Mark Effect in that case. But if you're just shy of a couple of percent, this is a really easy way of getting those few remaining percent. So yeah, just another option for you to consider. Moving on to the next item, the boots. Once again, kind of depends what you want. If you want a spell suppression, you obviously would have to start out with that modifier, right? If you don't really care about that mod, that gives you options, especially the option to use a veiled modifier for the prefixes, which is otherwise, once again, pretty expensive these days, so not really recommended. The way I would craft boots these days is by rolling with essences of greed until you hit the movement speed modifier. Can be tier 2, can be tier 1, right? The essence mod is better than the highest life mod you can otherwise roll, and you can still roll the best movement speed modifier. Essences of Zeal give you a movement speed mod that is slightly worse than the highest tier, and you can also only roll a lesser life modifier, so Essences of Greed are better here. And after rolling a movement speed modifier with the Essences of Greed that you find acceptable, what I personally would do is, well, if we have an open suffix, put on a block mod, and then slam for another modifier, right? Now, if you're not happy with the modifier you just rolled, you should probably just roll the item again. This is probably more economic than actually trying to remove this modifier with an Eldritch, I guess an Annul Orb in general, because it's unlikely that you're going to hit that mod, right? Because very often, I mean, obviously, got lucky, right? But very often you're going to remove one of the other modifiers. For the suffix, this is relevant, right? But if you remove the movement speed mod, you can, of course, try, right? In the end, what you would want to do is remove the shit mod and then slam for a better mod. Again, usually this is armor and evasion, right? Just like the gloves. Pure mod or one of the 2 hybrid mods. I personally wouldn't overspend here. I don't really think it's worth it. Now for the suffixes, if you have the fractured spell suppression mod or any other fractured modifier really, you can once again do prefixes cannot be changed and then reforge for resistance, right? Chaos is the easiest because there are fewer tiers that can be rolled, and then finish the item with, well, a crafted modifier. So elemental chaos resistance, attributes, that sort of thing. Now, If you aren't hellbent on the spell suppression mod, so if your build isn't spell suppression based and you also don't want it as an extra layer of defense, then you could do this craft a bit differently, right? Essentially, you could start out with a fractured veiled modifier, just like we did before, right? With the gloves. So you would get items with that modifier, and then you would fracture it with a fracturing orb. Personally, I don't really think it's worth it, right? We have 3 movement speed modifiers, and they aren't crazy good, right? Yeah, I guess this gives you more movement speed if you haven't been hit recently. This allows you to avoid being chilled. If you, oh, that's the crafted mod, sorry. If you find that valuable enough and you really don't need another suffix, okay, I guess. But you should keep in mind that this makes crafting everything else a bit more awkward, right? And the way you would do this is now you would still roll with the Essence of Greed, right? I would just roll for another prefix that you find acceptable. Personally, I would also not do too much here. Wouldn't invest too much currency for that. And then you would have to roll the suffixes with Eldritch Chaos Orbs. Personally, I don't really think it's worth it because the difference in terms of movement speed isn't valuable enough in my opinion. Unless you absolutely need this avoid being chilled, I personally don't really think it's worth it. Can of course still do it, right? Makes crafting the suffixes more expensive, right? Just like before, you would have to roll for 1 decent mod, slam for another one, and then finish the craft with well attributes or elemental and chaos resistance usually. Bit more limiting, and you definitely won't be able to roll something like a tier 1 spell suppression mod without overspending horribly. So yeah, first method is the one that I recommend. I guess you could alternatively use the first method and then try to introduce the veiled modifier via a veiled orb slam, but since you also have open suffixes, this is going to cost you, once again, around 100 diffs at current prices, because you have to do that approximately 6 times or so. So yeah, not the biggest fan of this, don't think it's worth it. But yeah, if you're hellbent on a veiled modifier, these are your 2 options, pretty much. The next item on the list is the chest. So what I usually like to use is either a grasping mail for the increased global defenses modifier. Can also be pure armor base, right? Or an armor and evasion base if you want to have the +1 specter modifiers. But these items are pretty similar, so I'm going to treat them as one. The grasping mail, as I said before, what you want is the increased global defenses, fractured. These days it's only 50%, but it hasn't been changed here. Just like the helmet, you're going to have to roll with, well, usually essences of loathing, because reservation efficiency is incredibly valuable. Alternatively, there's minion life via essences of fear. There are also some avoidance mods, but for the most part, it's usually loathing or fear. The others are not that good for minion builds. Rolling for the spell suppression mod is actually worse than it is on the helmet, because you have more tiers that you can roll for, and you also have some additional mods that you don't really have on the helmet. So yeah, this has 150. Expect more, but it's usually more around 200 or so. So keep that in mind. The issue is also that, just like on the helmet, we can roll spell suppression and an additional modifier. Now, I don't want to waste people's time once again, right? Let's say instead of the strength modifier, I rolled the tier 1 spell suppression. Again, it's going to take you a lot more rolls, as I mentioned before. If you have a third suffix, right, you're going to have to remove that, right? If you rolled something like this, right, prefixes don't matter, at least not at this point in time. You would have to remove that with an annul, and very often you're going to remove one of the target modifiers. Every time you do that, you would have to start over. This is a very expensive portion of the craft. I mean, essences for loathing aren't cheap, Still one of the few essences that are selling decently. So yeah, painful, but a necessary step, I'm afraid. The next step involves manipulating the prefixes. What we need is exactly one open prefix, so we can craft the suffixes cannot be changed meta mod. And what we want to do next is introduce a modifier, can be a resistance or physical damage reduction via add remove. And the good thing is this is deterministic, right? It's the only outcome that you can get. Now resistances tend to be a bit wonky because there are too many tiers. Chaos resistance is still the best in this case, right? Because there aren't that many tiers you can roll. For the other resistances, outcomes will be even worse. So personally, I don't really think this is the best way of crafting items like this. Instead, what I tend to do is I do add remove physical. And this is deterministic in the sense that it gives you a physical damage reduction modifier that ranges from 4 to 8%. At least for item level 80. What's that? 5? 86. And higher chests, if the tier is lower, you can obviously only roll tier 2s, right? But at least you're guaranteed to get the physical damage reduction modifier, as long as you don't have an open prefix after crafting the meta mod, right? If you don't have the life modifier here, then you're not going to introduce physical damage reduction. Instead, you will pretty much always introduce this horseshit reflect physical damage to melee attackers. So make sure that you have one open prefix and not two. Now, if you have an item that looks like this, right? That doesn't have an additional prefix here. Craft a block mod, doesn't matter what it is. Any block mod, and slam on a prefix. This is very important. And obviously also remove the block mod. You could also use Eldritch Exalted Orbs. Guess depends on the cost of that currency. Should be pretty similar to the blocking and then using regular Exalted Orbs. As long as you have this, right, you can always craft prefixes cannot be changed and add remove fizz, and you're guaranteed. Yeah. Obviously, craft suffixes can't be changed, my bad. And then add remove, and you're guaranteed to get the physical damage reduction. Once again, tier ranges from 4% to 8% physical damage reduction for item level 86 chests. If you're using a Spectre chest, right, let's say one that has the +1 maximum Spectres instead of the global defenses, right, and has a different base, but still armor and evasion based, right, so you can roll the spell suppression mod, would still be the exact same. It's not just the physical damage reduction modifier that has a lower maximum tier. That's another reason why it's kind of hard to play suppression-based Spectre builds, because the spell suppression modifier you can roll would also only be tier 2, right? So you would have to get the extra 3% from somewhere else. Now for this build, this doesn't matter, right? For the Barmer build that used this chest. But yeah, for Spectre builds, that is relevant. After crafting the suffixes, you can go ahead and start crafting the prefixes. If you still have the meta mod, you can do exactly one Reforged Life. If you didn't have that modifier, right, so let's say you didn't remove the other modifier, but instead removed the meta mod, then you can start rolling with Eldritch Chaos Orbs pretty much right away. Obviously, you have to make the Exarch dominant before you do this. And what you roll for is a maximum life modifier. Tier 1, Tier 2, once again, this depends on the item level, right? For Spectre chests, highest that you can get is Tier 2. And then you finish the item by crafting an appropriate prefix. Now there's something that needs to be said. Sometimes the Eldritch Chaos Orbs will not give you an additional modifier. Instead, they kind of just act like an Eldritch Orb of Scouring. That's because you already have 4 modifiers that are guaranteed. This isn't specific to the chests or some Craft of Exile artifact. This actually happens in-game. Makes the crafting process slightly more expensive, right? Essentially, you would have to use an Eldritch Chaos Orb and then Exalt Slam for the additional modifier. Bit of a nuisance, but overall, this is still the best way of crafting these chests, in my opinion. Now the modifier we rolled before, I quite... And as you can see, right, it actually happens quite often. So yeah, don't just spam Chaos Orbs, actually introduce an additional modifier via Exalted Orbs, because the Exalted Orbs are way cheaper than the Chaos Orbs, and I actually guarantee to give you an additional prefix under these conditions. As I said before, we're looking for life mod, right? Obviously not tier 6, right? It should be something a bit higher, like tier 2, tier 1 for item level 86 chests. You could, of course, also use the Eldritch Exalted Orbs, but on average, they tend to be a bit more expensive. So that's usually not the best option. Let's say this is a tier 2 life mod, don't want to waste people's time, right? Something like this. And then, as I mentioned before, you would finish the item by adding a crafted prefix. There are a couple of options here. For grasping males, crafting armor and evasion is pretty bad because the base values are pretty low, so that's not something I recommend. A good modifier overall is usually the increased maximum life, increased maximum mana. If you use a Divine Blessing setup for an additional aura, make sure that you roll down the maximum mana portion of the modifier, because you can actually increase the cost of the aura to the point where you can no longer use it. Instead of this mod, you could also get a different one. This one is interesting, right? Physical damage from hits taken as fire damage, physical damage from hits taken as lightning damage. Because it decreases the amount of physical damage you take, as long as your elemental resistances are high enough. That's one thing. The other thing is, this is invaluable against enemies that overwhelm physical damage reduction, because the portion of physical damage that is taken as fire and as lightning damage obviously doesn't have the resistance that it rolls against overwhelmed. Can really help with what is otherwise a nasty and dangerous modifier. Which one you prefer is up to you. I went with this mod because my Barmer build was already pretty decent against attacks. Once again, last step would be crafting the Eldritch Implicits. What we're looking for here is usually non-curse aura effect, because it scales pretty much everything. Alternatively, you could also go with maximum resistances, chaos, or for life-based builds very often fire. This is also what I considered for my current build, but ended up deciding to go with the effect of non-curse aura. But it is definitely an option that is worth mentioning. For the other implicit, we are usually looking at a specific aura that we want to scale, such as, well, determination for defenses, or hatred, for example, for damage. It's pretty much only the jewelry left. The minion shields are pretty much the same as they are for the energy shield based builds, and I've already made a crafting guide for that some time ago. I'm going to start out with the bells. Now, a lot of life-based builds want to use Darkness Enthroned, but this isn't usually the best way of scaling your defenses. It's usually more of an offensive option, so if you're looking for something that scales, especially life or resistances, then you can either use a Stygian Vice for the Abyssal socket, or you could alternatively use a mechanical belt that replaces this Mechalam belt, it hasn't been changed in Craft of Exile yet, to get access to an additional gem socket. Now, the first crafting technique I'm going to show you is not really that relevant for the mechanical builds, because there aren't enough of these in the economy that you can really use this particular technique on. So what we're looking for is a Stygian Vice that has a maximum life roll, optimally tier 1, and one additional prefix that is powerful, such as Armour, for example, but it could also be flasks applied to you have increased effect, right? One of these two modifiers, and then one open prefix, and, well, optimally, I guess, a full set of useful suffixes. The issue with this is very often a lot of people are looking for these items having active searches, so the amount of items with fully crafted or full range of useful suffixes is relatively low. So for the most part, you will only be able to get an item that will look like this, right? Some suffixes that aren't really that useful altogether. However, make sure that you have at least one open suffix in order to craft them later on, so you can wipe the suffixes with a meta mod. If you can't find any builds like this, you can open up one of the suffixes with an Orb of Annulment, but obviously that risks removing one of the prefixes. If you have an item that looks like this, for example, right, that has an open prefix, craft a dummy prefix to lower the chance of accidentally removing one of the target modifiers, then annul, and still break your item. Yeah, if that happens, obviously you have to buy a new build, right? Every time it happens, until you get that open suffix that you desire. The next step is relatively simple. You have to replace the dummy prefix with a dummy suffix. Can be pretty much anything. And then you want to use a Hunter's Exalted Orb to slam for one of the maximum life modifiers. Now this is a very lucky outcome. This takes around 10 or so tries for a tier 1 life mod. For the tier 2 life mod, it should be like 1 in 4 or so. So this isn't the most reliable way, or that it's not a cheap way of crafting these belts, but it's pretty much the only way that actually allows you to have 3 pretty decent prefixes while also being able to craft the suffixes later on, right? Speaking about the suffixes, the next step would include putting on prefixes can be changed, and then reforge for a target modifier. You can do Chaos, Cold, Fire, Lightning for one of the resistances. Once again, Chaos works best because there are fewer Chaos resistance modifiers here. What you could do alternatively is you could do Reforge Speed for one of the Hunter mods, either Cast Speed during Flask Effect, which is not that good, for the Movement Speed modifier. It's not the craziest modifier, but it can be deterministically introduced, and some people want more movement speed in their builds, so that's one way of doing that. It costs you another modifier, which, well, modifier pressure is usually pretty high in minion builds, so you might not be able to actually afford this. If you accidentally introduce a second modifier this way that you don't want, you can always put on prefixes cannot be changed and either reforge again, or you could try to annul the mod away if you want to keep the modifier you just introduced. Personally, reforge and then trying to reintroduce it is better, unless it's a really rare mod, like let's say a tier 1 resistance modifier. But for this movement speed stuff, it's usually not that sensible. The next step involves slamming a modifier with an Exalted Orb. That's one of the ways of getting a second modifier here. Usually this isn't crazy good. There are lots of modifiers to choose from. We can't really block anything because the crafted modifiers don't really have overlap with modifiers we don't want, right? We could obviously block Strength, but Strength is probably one of the better modifiers you want. Strength and then obviously Resistances, so I don't really recommend that. This isn't the most reliable way, and personally I don't think this is a good way of actually crafting the item. Instead, what's usually more sensible is to craft 3 crafted modifiers, prefixes cannot be changed, and then use a Veiled Orb. Once again, especially later in the league, this is expensive, and has a 1 in 3 chance of removing the modifier you just introduced, right, independently of what that modifier is. If it didn't remove the modifier, you want to replace whatever meta mod is left, and then put on a block mod. For belts, this is regenerate energy shield while a rare or unique enemy is nearby, and then unveil, right? What you're looking for is pretty much what you can see here, resistances and attributes. Personally, I would go with the attributes here because strength and dex is pretty valuable, and the modifier scaling is also higher for veiled attribute mods. After that, you can finish the belt with, well, the crafted modifier, usually once again elemental resistances, since we unveiled a attribute mod that is not really available, right? Guess you could also do flask effect duration or Forbama cooldown recovery rate, but I don't really think that's necessary for the most part. So yeah. And that's pretty much this version of the belt craft. Now, as I mentioned before, this doesn't really work with the mechanical builds because there aren't enough of these in economy to do the Hunter's Exalted Orb slams. This is only really relevant for Stygian Vices, and even then it's an expensive way of crafting this item, simply because the Hunter's Exalted Orbs aren't cheap, and you need to also buy the bases, a couple of them actually. So yeah. And what you could do, if you actually failed the Hunter's Exalted Orb slam, and introduced a modifier that you don't want, is you can still use this item, because for the next version of this craft, all we pretty much need is Stygian Vice with the Hunter influence. The way you would do this is essentially would just roll the item with pristine fossils, right, until you hit both max life modifiers here. You're also getting some other life modifiers very often, right, such as this increased blast life recovery rate. Takes you around 150, I believe, to actually hit both tier 1s, maybe even slightly more. Yeah, 150 or so until you hit both modifiers. Now, in this case, we actually rolled an item with a full set of suffixes too, which is obviously bad, right? If that happens, you have to gamble your item and annul. That simply is what it is these days. If you remove a garbage prefix, then by all means put on a block mod, right, to lower the chance of removing one of the target prefixes in the next step. But yeah, obviously, you might still get unlucky, and then you would have to do it all over again, right? Fossil craft until you hit these two modifiers. Now, if that doesn't happen, right, you just remove one of the suffixes, then you can proceed just like we did before, right? Put on prefixes can't be changed, reforge, let's say chaos in this case, until you hit a modifier that you like. Keep in mind that this can also introduce 3 suffixes, so don't overshoot in terms of modifiers. Tier 2s are pretty good, right? Difference between tier 1s and tier 2s is usually not that large. And then you can either do an Exalted Slam for a random modifier, get lucky, hit a tier 2 cold resistance mod, or can do the a bit more reliable thing, right, but also more expensive thing, which is 3 crafted modifiers, prefixes can't be changed, and a Veiled Slam. Right? Might remove the mod you wanted to keep though. If that happens, you can do one or two things. Either you can just, well, not unveil to begin with, and just reforge chaos again, right, because we still have the meta mod on the item. Or you could remove the meta mods and try to slam on new mod. Hard to say which is more economic. Personally, I like gambling, so I usually just take off these crafted mods and then just slam. If you get lucky and hit, well, you're pretty much done crafting, right? Put on another modifier and then call it a day. If you ever don't hit, right, you introduce something valuable like a tier 8 life region modifier, well, you gambled and lost, right? That is what it is. In that case, you would have to do prefixes can be changed once again, introduce a modifier of your liking, right? And then do the aforementioned step. Hopefully this time you get lucky, right? If that doesn't happen, once again, rinse and repeat until you get what you want. Block mod, still the same. Unveil. Take the mod, craft something else, and call it a day. Especially if you have like double tier 1 life mods, I wouldn't try to overshoot with the suffixes because it's pretty disgusting to craft this item in general, right? Every time you do a reforge, you can always brick your item. And as you saw before, lots and lots of ways of accidentally removing one of the target modifiers. After that's done, obviously you want to use a catalyst. The best one here is, of course, Fertile Catalyst for life, right? Would even go so far as to divine the item until I get like maximum value for this life mod here, because it is pretty valuable. Right? So yeah, the other mods don't matter too much. The crafted modifier can always be deterministically rerolled to full value if needed, but yeah. As I mentioned before, this also works with the mechanical build, right? For the mechanical builds, you wouldn't probably start out with a base that is any bit desirable. Instead, you would just slam a Hunter's Exalted Orb to get the Hunter influence. Alternatively, you could also start out with any influenced mechanical build and then just reforge the influence with harvest. Not sure what's cheaper. Kind of depends on how expensive the influenced mechanical builds are. Last but not least, there are some rings left to craft. Now, the rings in question usually are a bone ring and an unset ring. I'm going to start out with the bone ring. What we want to start out with in particular is a fractured life modifier, but not the base version because, well, it's not good enough, honestly. Instead, you should start out with an item that has this incursion modifier, the tier 2 that you can see here, that's better. It's no longer in the game, it's a legacy modifier. Obviously, you're going to have to self-fracture these. Very few of these with a fracture mod will ever exist in the economy, right? Optimally, you get one with 4 modifiers, right? The other 3 modifiers don't matter. If you have an item with more mods, you're going to have to null it down to 4 modifiers here before using a fracturing orb. Unlike the Eldritch influenced items, or the items that can have Eldritch influence on the rings, you're just going to have to use Orbs of Annulment, right? Sometimes you remove the target mod. It is what it is. If you absolutely can't find enough of these rings in the economy anymore, then yeah, just start up with a fractured life based. But obviously this is better, right? Because it also has 2% increased maximum life, which is very valuable for life based builds. You're going to need 4 of these on average, right, until you fracture the right modifier. And on average, if you fracture a different modifier, this item just ends up being trash. So yeah, do this until you get this fractured mod. But you can, of course, just use a regular fractured life. Works just as well, it's just a bit worse in terms of, well, what it overall provides for your build, I guess. And these fractured bases are then rolled with bound fossils. What we're looking for is minion damage and minion attack and cast speed. If you want the highest tiers, you're going to have to roll more often. I think it's around 150 or so. For both tier 1 modifiers. It's more like 250, actually maybe even 300. So yeah, if you want double tier 1, you're going to have to roll quite a lot. Very often you end up with additional suffixes. If you want to keep these additional suffixes, then it's pretty fine, right? You're pretty much done already. The only thing I'm missing here is just an Exalted Orb Slam for an additional mod. Be a bit careful here, right? If you have a build that uses a Divine Blessing support, because the mana is actually, well, these can be a detrimental mod, right? It can make the aura that you're supporting with Divine Blessing too expensive. But it's usually you don't get a mana mod, and if you get a mana mod, it's very often not a high tier. Obviously, can be an issue. So if you aren't quite sure, you might just want to skip this portion altogether. Now, if you don't want the additional suffixes you've rolled here, right? So the minion elemental resistances, let's say you're playing on the Necromancer, especially if you're playing a pure Spectre build, the Spectres tend to have more than enough resistances to the point where this modifier just literally doesn't do anything. And you guessed it, in order to progress the craft, you would have to null, right? If you remove one of the target modifiers, so minion damage and minion attack and cast speed, you would have to start over again. It's always the same song. There's not much I can do about this, I'm afraid. After you've managed to end up with an item that kind of looks like this, maybe an additional prefix, there are some ways of introducing new modifiers. Obviously, you could always put on a block mod, right? A block prefix in this case, and then just do a regular Exalted Orb Slam. However, most modifiers on the rings are really nothing to write home about. I mean, personally, I don't think this is a good way. It's cheap, but it very often doesn't give you what you want. So I don't think this is the most effective way of moving forward. Instead, what you can do is you can put on 3 crafted modifiers, and then it kind of depends what you want for the prefixes. If you don't mind rolling mana and want to make sure that you get a modifier that has at least some value for your build, then put on cannot roll attack modifiers, and then do an Exalted Orb Slam. Because the only modifiers you can roll at this point are evasion rating, maximum energy shield, maximum mana, and rarity. right? You cannot roll any of these garbage attack mods because, well, due to the meta mod we put on earlier, right? So as long as you don't mind the mana, absolutely go ahead and do this, right? If you are playing in a build that uses a Divine Blessing set up to fit another aura, I don't recommend that, right? So don't craft cannot roll attack modifiers. Instead, craft prefixes cannot be changed, slam, and then we're using this setup for the next step, right? Which is, you guessed it, another Veiled Orb slam. Before unveiling, you should put on a block mod. The most effective one is minimum frenzy charges. Unveil, what we're looking for is lightning and chaos resistance, attributes, or minimum endurance charge. It's usually best to go with the attributes, as I mentioned before, because the veiled versions of the modifiers, of the attribute modifiers, have a higher scaling than, let's say, the resistance modifiers have. This is taken to an extreme with the endurance charge, right? The endurance charge modifier doesn't really give us pretty much anything because the veiled mod only gives you a chance to gain a endurance charge on kill, which isn't really relevant for us, right? So the order in which you want to take things is attributes, then resistances, and then the endurance charge mod. If you rolled either attributes or resistances, you want to finish the item usually with endurance charges. If your build doesn't have endurance charges, my current build already has endurance charges, so I don't really need that, right? So I would just finish this with resistances. But if you don't have that, an extra minimum endurance charge is usually what you want to go with. On the flip side, if you only got the minimum endurance charge modifier, finish the item with attributes or resistances, whatever your build needs. And last but not least, there is the Unset Ring. Crafting process is somewhat similar. At least the initial step is, of course, the exact same, right? You want the incursion mod, fractured. If you can't get an item like this, there aren't enough in the economy left to actually do this, then just go ahead and use a regular fractured life mod. And the next step is rolling with pristine fossils for the life recoup. This is an incredibly valuable form of recovery because it pretty much always is active whenever you need it, right? Which is when you take damage. It doesn't work against damage over time. It only works against damage from hits, but it's still incredibly valuable. And as such is something that I highly recommend. Can reduce the amount of damage you take from Progenesis, for example, right? In general, it's just additional recovery and it's valuable. So I think it's one of the better modifiers you can roll. Now, under rare circumstances, you can also manage to roll plus level of socketed gems here. This isn't something I would target. Rolling both of these modifiers at the same time is rather challenging. So yeah, don't try to force this outcome unless you want a perfect item, which I don't really think is worth it. I'm just going to pretend we didn't roll that, right, for the sake of it. Because it is relatively unlikely, as I said. Now, if you roll an additional suffix that you don't want, what you have to do is annul it. Very often in the process of doing that, you actually end up annulling the recoup. If that happens, you obviously have to start over again. Now, if you end up with an item that has only this suffix and a number of prefixes, what you can do is pretty much the exact same thing we did before, right? So for example, you can do 3 crafted modifiers and either cannot roll attack mods if you want to make sure to slam on modifiers that are useful. This also increases the chance of the plus level of socketed gems. It's still relatively unlikely. I think for the tier 3 it's like more than 50 or so. But this way you make sure that you end up with modifiers that you can use. Once again, if you don't want the mana mod, don't put on the cannot roll attack modifiers. Also makes the craft a bit cheaper, right? Because if you do it this way, the next step would be to remove the modifiers, the meta mods, and then to put on a new set of meta mods, which, well, it's an extra for divs, right? Once again, a Veiled Orb Slam. Hopefully not removing the damage taken recoup as life. If you remove it, you have to start over again. And then obviously also remove the crafted mod, replace it with a block mod. Once again, frenzy charges is optimal. Unveil, and take the modifier that you like. And then finish with either endurance charges, attributes, if you didn't roll that, right? Or resistances. Alternatively, if you want a crafted prefix, like reduced mana cost to non-channeling skills on your item, after reaching a state where you have essentially just the damage recouped as life modifier and up to 1 prefix, what you can do is craft a suffix that cannot be changed, and then introduce a new modifier via add remove. The best modifier here is add remove chaos, because there is pretty much nothing but chaos resistance to roll. The issue with this is that it's expensive, especially later on in the league. Alternatively, you could also roll the item with pristine and aberrant fossils that will take around 400 or so tries. So not sure this is actually more economic, right? You will most likely also have a third suffix that you need to annul once again. Choice is up to you. If you add a modifier that you don't like, right, obviously you would have to annul it, start over again if you accidentally annul the other modifier. It's not great, right? This version of the Ringcraft is much more expensive because we still need to do a Veiled Slam later on. Sadly, not much you can do about this. Also, since we have an open prefix, in the next step, right, you can always accidentally introduce a prefix via the Veiled Slam, as I just did. And there aren't that many prefixes that we want. Obviously, you can put on a block mod, right, one of these attack mods here, but on average, what we're getting is nothing to write home about. You can always get this modifier as a Veiled mod, which is kind of the run-up, I guess. Nowhere near as good as the minus mana cost to non-channeling skills, but at least you can make something out of a bad situation, right? When you accidentally introduce a veiled prefix. Now, if you don't introduce a veiled prefix this way, right, if it's a veiled suffix, you're pretty much good to go. But as you can see here, it happens quite a lot. And this step before is also expensive. I mean, this chaos resistance is nothing to write home about, right? On average, every veiled suffix is going to yield you something, right? Strength and intelligence, any attribute really, resistances, charges. Unlike the other craft before, we can't put on a block mod, right? So you will encounter frenzy and power charges, which is annoying. For the most part, though, as long as you get a veiled suffix, you're pretty good to go. And obviously, you would finish the item with the crafted prefix of your choice, right? So non-channeling skills. If you still have an open prefix, this is where you could slam another modifier. If you don't have an open prefix anymore, right? Because let's say you started out with an item that had a prefix and there's this modifier, then yes, well, wouldn't have had to do that. This method is obviously much more expensive, and if you want to have a decent resistance modifier here, you're going to have relatively deep pockets. I'm not sure if the add remove is actually the best way of doing it. It's a bit hard to calculate. Rolling with aberrant and pristine might actually be more sensible, but it's definitely going to take longer, right? That's also a factor that you have to keep in mind. Every bit of time you spend crafting is time not spent farming. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Covered most of the basic stuff. If I need to add anything in the future, it will probably come in the form of another video or a short explanation in the actual build guide. But yeah, for the most part, I think that covers the most important items. In general, try to use veiled orbs as little as possible. If you have to use veiled orbs, try to craft these items early on in the league when they are like a diff or two, and not later on in the league where they're like, I don't know, 13 diffs. And who knows how much more expensive they're going to get in the future. But yeah, if you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments. I try to get to them as soon as I can. If you want to connect with me or my community, you can find my socials, including Twitch, Discord, and Patreon in the description of this video or on my channel page. I hope you liked it. Until next time.